we live?
We are live.
Miracles do happen.
Miracles. Magnets, man. How do they work?
I don't know. I've heard rumors, though, about why they work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so here we are, man. This is this show is becoming a thing.
Yeah, man.
People are watching it.
I'm gonna give you some surprise good news today. I'm not sure if you saw it on Twitter.
Oh.
But yeah, this is starting to be fun. Like I'm starting to feel like we're having a positive effect a little bit.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So literally 3 hours ago, Biden tweeted this out.
Oh, he's been watching?
Yeah, he's been watching our show.
About time. Oh, yeah. I did see this. Yeah, this is totally the pipeline we have with the White House paying off.
Yeah, I think it was everything we've done with Karine Jean-Pierre.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, of course, she's been talking to me for a while, but it because I've been expressing my admiration, shall we say, for her on this show. Yeah. Well, Joe, so I saw the headline today, and I immediately thought, is this going to help Dan? And no. I mean, this is a start. I will say that. I'm not going to praise anybody, but because this is just for possession. So apparently, according to this, he will be releasing people who were convicted for possessing marijuana, but not for people like Dan who were trafficking in it, which is the word they like to use. So we'll see. He promised, I believe, didn't he, during the election, that he would release everybody?
Well,
not just.
I'd have to find the clip from the debate. But yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if during the actual debate, Biden's words were, nobody should be in jail for marijuana. And then as the campaign went on, it's been this line that he says, no one should be in jail just for using or possessing marijuana. Like that's the lawyer talk, politician talk to narrow it down to something that's a little bit more accomplishable, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm guessing, and I think I told Dan this. I did tell Dan this. I think that eventually he will get released, and all the dealers, the weed dealers, will get released from prison. It's just a question of how long it'll take. The thing is, though, it's sort of remarkable that Biden even did this. I don't know why he did, because there's virtually no movement for this anymore. I mean, the drug legalization movement kind of died. I mean, you just don't see. I mean, back 5, 10, 15 years ago, it was significant. And, you kind of saw them in the news, and the organizations were gaining memberships, and the leaders of those organizations had a presence in the media. But I mean, it was the last time we heard from Normal or Ethan Nadelman or, those people who were leading that amazing campaign that was so successful, or at least partially successful. I don't know. But, why did Biden do this? Probably shoring up his base coming into the election, because a lot of Democrats smoke weed.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's too impossible that Biden knows he's in the tank right now. He's the least popular president since polling data has existed. We're coming into the midterms. There's a movement out there called No Pardons, No Votes.
Yep.
And we held him to this specific campaign promise, and he delivered in some small way.
Yeah. Oh, I realized I didn't use Dan's last name. So for people who aren't familiar, Dan Musig was on Unregistered 6 months ago-ish, somewhere around there. And he was on the show just before he went into prison. He was convicted for, as I said, trafficking cannabis, and by the way, only cannabis, and there were no charges of him doing any violence. It was simply trafficking cannabis. He just began a 5-year sentence in a federal prison in West Virginia, and he's been in there for about 3 or 4 months now. So I don't think, and I think I told him this, I don't think he will be in there I don't think he'll serve the full sentence, because for many reasons, but I think one of them will be that some president is going to pardon him and all the drug dealers. Although, then again, if Trump wins, Trump should be for legalization. I mean, I think if he were not beholden to the MAGA movement, he would be all for legalizing drugs, because he's obviously a drug addict himself. I mean, I think it's pretty clear he does some sort of speed or Adderall. But yeah, so that's scary. That's where I'm really quite upset with MAGA, because they are deaf, dumb, and blind to this issue, and that this is why they keep talking about the cartels as the problem, or the drug dealers domestically in the United States as the problem causing crime. They never once mention legalization as an idea that would eliminate the cartels and would eliminate violent drug gangs, because they would have no longer any reason to exist. So we'll see. This is a decent start. I'm glad that there will be some people getting pardons. He doesn't say anything about expunging records, which is one of the most heinous aspects of legalization of marijuana. I have many friends who were busted 5, 10, 15 years ago for possession or low-level dealing, who still have a hard time getting a job because it is still counted on their record. They are still considered to be felons. That needs to happen. We've got to expunge all those convictions, everything that's on people's records. It's grotesque. So we'll see.
Yeah, this point right here that he has, third, we classify marijuana at the same level as heroin and more serious than fentanyl. It makes no sense. Right. The Schedule 1 classification of marijuana. The whole scheduling of drugs at all makes no sense federally. Like,
oh yeah,
heroin has a medical use. It literally does. Any drug has a medical use. Any drug given by a doctor under the right supervision has a totally safe use. I understand that marijuana, you can't die from it, so there's that. But yeah, the whole federal outlook on drugs is just completely out of the purview of the Constitution and completely absurd.
You're saying that American drug policy is somewhat irrational, Michael?
Yeah.
You're suggesting that? Yeah, none of it makes any sense, and it's all driven by sort of puritanical superstition and ignorance about drugs. You know, these laws are written by people, unfortunately, who aren't drug takers, generally speaking, and are not familiar with that culture or just drugs in general. Everyone should go read Carl Hart, and he's the Columbia professor who for years has been publishing books and studies showing that these drugs, so-called hard drugs like heroin, are far less addictive and dangerous and harmful than we believe as a society. And he, to illustrate that point, he came out publicly. Again, this is a professor at Columbia University, my alma mater. He says that publicly, he said about a year ago that he snorts heroin on the regular, I think every day. He uses it to relax after a long day of teaching and lecturing and researching. He describes it. He hangs out in his study and does some lines of heroin. And he's been doing this for years, and he continues to be Carl Hart, world famous public intellectual and professor with many books and other publications and legions of students. And he is in the media doing interviews and all the things. And he seems pretty smart and pretty competent, and he looks awfully healthy. In fact, since I'm really heterosexual, I don't know these things, but I've heard from gay men and straight women that he's very attractive too. So he does not look like what we imagine a heroin user to look like. And that's true for meth as well. A lot of the stuff that we ascribe to meth as the effects of meth they're not really. They're because people are poor, or they're not sleeping enough, so they don't take care of themselves. But meth does not cause your teeth to fall out. It's not taking care of them because you're not sleeping and you're weirded out that causes them to fall out. So anyway, I think I've done this. I think I've said this rant before on this show about drugs and how I think that actually more experimentation with drugs would be very good for society. I understand you can die of overdoses on many of these drugs. I understand that cocaine, just snorting cocaine, can kill you if you have a heart defect, and that's happened. I understand that addiction is a thing. I am an addict. I was addicted to alcohol for about 2 decades. And by the way, I just celebrated 10 years of sobriety, at least with alcohol. I haven't had a drink of alcohol in 10 years. So I know about that world. I've been in AA meetings. My stepfather was a drug and alcohol counselor for Santa Clara County. I know this stuff, and I've been around it. I've known many addicts of many kinds. And I do think that Carl Hart is essentially right. The big problem is we have ignorance, tremendous widespread ignorance about these drugs, especially the so-called hard drugs. And it's driven by a puritanical assumption that all drugs are evil and harmful. And that's why we still have the war on drugs. And that's why we have, therefore, the Mexican cartels. And that's why we have tens of thousands of people every year across the world getting killed because of this drug war. It all stems from American Puritanism. The reason we have the cartels is because the United States has made drugs illegal, driving up the prices, and of course, keeping out all the legitimate businessmen from that market, meaning that only the bad guys, the killers, the criminals will enter that market, since it's a black market, and will do the damage that we have seen socially. So you legalize drugs. I'm going to keep saying this until I die, until they do it. And almost instantly, we will see really revolutions in people's daily lives. People who live in the so-called ghettos in the cities where most of the drug dealing goes on, people who live in Mexico, in much of South America, where the drug war has just killed so many people and damaged so many people's lives. That will be a revolution, a worldwide revolution for the better, the second the United States legalizes drugs.
Yeah. As much as this is a positive note to have, we can't let up on the brakes. I think Biden and Trump don't want to make the distinction for drug dealers. Like, it's socially unacceptable still to advocate for a drug dealer.
Yep.
And I don't see them having that in their policy. Like, in their heads, a drug dealer belongs in jail. A drug dealer is a net negative on the community, even though everybody smokes weed, everybody does something.
Yeah, Trump's even worse than that. I mean, Trump just a few months ago called for basically, I think, extrajudicial executions of drug dealers. Or, sorry, he wants a fast trial for drug dealers that ends in execution. I mean, he said that. He wants to mimic the policies of Southeast Asian countries like Singapore and the Philippines, where they just shoot drug dealers in the street. He likes that, even though he's got white powder flying out of his nose every time he talks.
Yeah, it's funny. He's a teetotaler. He's never had a sip of alcohol in his life. He's never smoked anything in his life, he says. But somebody in the comments Josh is asking, why do people keep saying Trump uses amphetamines? Nobody that age has that much energy, period.
Yeah.
If it's not amphetamines, it's modafinil. It's something.
Right.
Yeah.
Same with Biden too. I mean, I'm quite sure Biden is doing something. I mean, and I think you can even see the pupils get real big on both of them if you look closely. Yeah, no, I mean, it's pretty clear they're doing something to keep them going.
Yeah. It's so going on from that. We just did our JFK course a couple nights ago.
Amazing. God damn it, that was amazing. Larry Hancock, independent researcher and scholar. He's been working on this for 30 years, and there are a bunch of recently released documents over the last 5 years that, just shed all kinds of light on the assassination and who might have done it and why. And so this is all basically new research that, by the way, academics, as I said in the class, have ignored. Professional historians, my colleagues are not interested in this. But as we found out in the class, by understanding who probably did it and why, you understand a whole lot about American politics, American foreign policy, about the history of the CIA and the FBI. It has wide-ranging significance and implications that people really need to study this. And I was absolutely amazed by what Larry has found, and it really confounded a lot of my assumptions about it. I had always written it off too as unimportant and as being just the product of a lone crazy guy, Lee Harvey Oswald. Almost definitely not true. I'm almost definitely wrong about that, or was wrong about that. Larry has changed my mind. And again, I've been teaching this stuff for decades, but he found stuff that just is amazing. Short story, I guess I can give a little bit of a spoiler alert, but he's really proven, without a doubt, Larry Hancock has, that there was a massive federal government-wide cover-up that was orchestrated by J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI. Number one, that is just indisputable. And then number two, we do know that there were about a half a dozen CIA agents operating in the Miami field station who had major antipathy toward Kennedy for various reasons. Kennedy was, in fact, a Cold Warrior, anti-communist hawk. He was building up the military. He was gung-ho against the commies for sure, but he was not happy with how the CIA handled the Bay of Pigs for obvious reasons. And so he was actually taking Cuba away from the CIA. No longer was the CIA, and I think you told me this a couple months ago and I laughed at you about it. He no longer was the CIA going to be doing work in Cuba because, and this was their main focus, of course, they've been trying to kill Castro for years, various ways. And Kennedy, because of the Bay of Pigs and other things, took that away from them. And so they had some reason to hate Kennedy. They may very well have had reason to kill Kennedy. And I didn't give any credence to any of these theories before this, but it seems almost indisputable at this point.
Mm-hmm. And he does dispel the kookier parts of the CIA conspiracy theories too.
Yeah.
The Devil Chessboard book, which a lot of people go to, which doesn't explicitly say that Allen Dulles was involved, but it paints a picture of Allen Dulles having a personal grudge against Kennedy and being maniacally obsessed with Kennedy. But there's no evidence that he had anything to do with this plot. There is probably evidence that he knew what his underlings were up to, and he knew that these radical people out there existed, and that he served on the Warren Commission, and he probably wanted to cover up any tracks to keep the CIA running. But the personal animus of Allen Dulles being the guy who orchestrated the hit is just probably a complete fantasy.
No, Dulles had no reason to do that. That would have been utterly self-destructive and foolish of him. He had a huge career, obviously, in the foreign policy establishment, and he wasn't about to sully that by killing the damn president over basically like an interagency conflict. You know, it was basically a fight between the executive and the CIA over who would handle Cuba. It wasn't over big questions. It wasn't over whether the United States should be the bulwark against communism or anything like that, or whether the United States should be aggressive against communism. Kennedy, I mean, I think Larry and I have differences on that a little bit, but, you know, Kennedy was a hawk until the minute he died. And in fact, the speech he was going to give in Dallas on November 26 is a classic Cold Warrior speech in which he talks about the evils of communism and the necessity of the United States standing in the breach against it. So, yeah, but the fallout from the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy's reshuffling of basically the foreign policy apparatus does suggest strongly to me that there were people in there in the CIA who had reason to kill him. And I think they probably did.
The good scholarship on the Kennedy assassination always pointed to these mysterious Cubans who were trained by the CIA. And, you know, before now, you don't really know who they are. But Larry's research, he names names.
Names.
So we go through them in our course, and it's astonishing. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. It's we've had many great courses, but this I think is the best so far. I was kind of shouting at the end of it. I was so excited. Remember at the very end, we stayed on for another hour after Larry left. He gave a 3-hour presentation, more than a 3-hour presentation. And then we stayed on for another almost hour talking about it because we were so excited about it and all of its bigger implications and why liberal establishment historians are not interested in this kind of thing. Why liberals in general and establishment people in general, including conservatives, are hostile to conspiracy theories, and especially conspiracy theories about assassinations or about election fraud. They don't like to talk about it because it represents an existential threat. If you're calling into question a major agency like the CIA, or if you're calling into question an election, you're calling into question everything, all of the people who hold office, hold power in the state. Now, none of us have any reason to respect them, obey them, defer to them, because, you know, it's now very clear that they're utterly corrupt, and they could have gotten there by very nefarious means, by either cheating on an election or having an opponent taken care of. So this is why you're not allowed to talk about elections or about assassinations.
Yeah. This is kind of my political origin story, is learning about the JFK assassination.
Oh,
yeah, when I was
okay.
reading about it when I was like 13.
Hmm.
Yeah, I always thought conspiracy theories were dumb. Like there
Mm.
was the History Channel 9/11 conspiracy theories show,
Mm-hmm.
which took the kookiest 9/11 conspiracy theories and debunked them without ever addressing the main ones like Building 7. You know, they
Man.
were like, "Oh, debris fell," and they used MapQuest to say it fell farther than where it fell. Okay, but I stumbled upon the JFK stuff, and I'm like, "All right, it's obvious that the Warren Commission was a cover up.
Mm-hmm.
That's stated like from the
It's for
get
sure.
go.
Yeah,
The
that's for sure.
intention of the Warren Commission was to get this narrative, this preconceived conclusion, as the accepted narrative for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Period.
Yeah. Yeah, we have that memo from J. Edgar Hoover that we showed in the class,
Mhm.
in which he says, we must convince the public that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone.
Yeah.
We must convince the public of that. I mean, it's just straight up. And this is, I think, 2 days. He wrote this memo just 2 days after the assassination. And then we have evidence, which Larry presented, that the FBI was directly controlling the editorial boards of all the major newspapers and instructing them to never make any point except that Kennedy was killed by Oswald, to not do any investigations of any possible conspiracies. Yeah, it's very clear that they were covering it up. Now, the only question is why were they covering it up? But I think I pointed to one reason. I think there's others too,
Yeah.
especially if it is in fact the CIA or was the CIA. And by the way, it was rogue agents within the CIA. Larry was very clear about this. It was not the CIA itself. The director of the CIA at the time almost certainly had nothing to do with it, didn't know about it, and the whole leadership in Washington of the CIA probably had nothing to do with it. It was about a half a dozen agents in the Miami field office.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And I bring this up because like Cuba to me is super relevant still.
Ah, Cuba. Yes.
Yeah. And the Hurricane Ian wiped through Florida. It wiped
Yeah.
through Puerto Rico, and it did
Mhm.
run through Cuba. And you're seeing street protests in Cuba,
Mhm.
similar kind of in spirit to what's happening in Iran, kind of in what's happening all over the world. And I just
Mhm.
want to show you how that's being portrayed in the media right now.
Okay.
Cuatro días, desde el martes a las 10 de la mañana aquí no hay luz, desde el martes. Y entonces en otros lugares hay luz. ¿Qué hacemos? ¿Qué hacemos? Lo único que queremos es luz. Yo tuve que botar toda mi comida hoy porque no tenía dónde guardarla. Y estamos pasando la de Caín, por eso lo tuvimos que tirar para la calle. Y nos vamos a seguir tirando para la calle.
This is a very complicated story.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me tell you sort of my history of studying Cuba, sort of what I know, the history of it. So beginning in the late 1980s, and this is according to some reporting done in the New York Times and elsewhere, this was at the dawn of hip hop had become big in the United States, right? Late 80s. By the late 80s, according to some sources that have been confirmed, you had ordinary Cubans dangling wire hangers out of their windows in their apartment buildings which had wires attached to their radios so that they could pick up the radio waves from the Miami hip hop station just across the water there.
Mm-hmm.
And hip hop took off in Cuba. So did heavy metal. So did all kinds of American pop music, as did reggaeton, which is sort of the Latin American version of hip hop. And so Western style pop culture became very big there, and this is kind of the story across the world. And Castro, since the beginning, had been trying to squash all forms of American pop culture because they were so popular and because it was American and because much of it was not about communist discipline. It was about partying and having a good time and all that. wasn't about being a good proletarian revolutionary. And we know this. Che Guevara led the fight against Western pop culture. You know, they banned jazz, they banned rock and roll, they banned all sorts of stuff. So in the 1980s, it becomes more difficult because of technology, because of the radio, and they figure out this thing with the wire hangers. And then, of course, CDs and DVDs get imported illegally. They get brought in as contraband. And then, of course, the internet happens, and then it becomes basically impossible. Even though they shut down the internet in Cuba, people can bring in flash drives, which basically had just huge sections of the internet on it, and people could just plug the flash drives into their computers and watch or listen to anything they wanted to. And so consequently, that kind of stuff, that kind of rowdy street level pop culture stuff, just got bigger and bigger and bigger in Cuba, and people started to naturally become more and more sympathetic to America and Americans, and more expressing interest in moving to America or bringing Americans to Cuba, only because of pop culture, not because of the presidents or the senators, not because of the American government, but because of the good stuff in America. And this has all been a threat to the communist regime there. So I have always been, just, of course, totally on the side of the people who are doing this stuff in Cuba and against the communist government, because I'm an anti-communist and because I like pop culture and I like fun and pleasure and freedom, which is what it represents. So the thing is, we don't know exactly when this started, but at some point between the time the first Cuban dangled their wire hanger out of their window and listened to Miami hip hop, somewhere between then and now, guess who? The CIA got involved and started to try to co-opt this and started to promote, sponsor, assist some Cuban rappers and some Cuban rock stars and heavy metal players. And it's very clear, and this is because of Max Blumenthal's great reporting at the Gray Zone. Our friend Max Blumenthal has done this, and others as well. The protests that began in July of last year,
yeah.
Big street protests in July of last year, 2021. We now know the leaders of this movement, the San Ysidro movement, which is this movement of Cuban, mostly hip hop musicians, I think, and pop stars in Cuba.
Visual artists as well.
Yeah. It's anti-regime. And well, guess what? They did these tours of the United States, and there's pictures and videos of them hanging out with Marines and CIA agents and talking about, and get this, the leaders of the San Ysidro movement, and that's who's leading these protests in the street, apparently. Mm-hmm. They are calling for annexation of Cuba by the United States. I mean, they're straight up Yankees. They're straight up Yankee imperialists, or running dogs for the Yankee imperialists. So how much, this is just like our conversation about Iran last week, mm-hmm. How much of what we see in the streets is authentic,
yes,
genuine rebellion against the totalitarianism of the Cuban government and for the freedom represented by rap music, and how much of it has been orchestrated by America, mm-hmm. by the U.S. government, specifically the Central Intelligence Agency. And that we'll never probably know exactly, but we do know that the leaders, at least the self-appointed leaders of this anti-communist movement in Cuba, the leaders are up to their necks in Central Intelligence Agency.
Yeah. It's wild. It's hard to, again, just like everything else, it's hard to find good information. I played that clip because the story that the BBC is running with is this is all because of the hurricanes. They just want electricity, right? But they're chanting Libertad in the streets. They're chanting Libertad, like, mm-hmm. which is the exact same thing they were chanting in the streets a year ago. Yep. Now, just like everywhere else in the world, the material conditions being a crisis definitely exacerbate and is what is making this probably a pressing issue right now immediately. Like,
sure.
There have been confrontations with police. So when I looked this up, there's two kinds of channels. There's one that will show you the found footage of like a cell phone taking video of like rioters or protesters fighting with cops and chanting Libertad and all that. And then there's the other one, which is Belly of the Beast Cuba, which I don't know where they get their funding from, but it's really sleek cameras interviewing people on the streets saying, this is only about electricity. We just want our electricity back. It seems like Cuban national propaganda. I still listen to it because there's probably a decent amount of people there who are supportive of their government and don't want, and rightfully so, don't want annexation by the United States. You know, they understand that the people who have been embargoing them for the last 60 years and trying to murder their past presidents don't have the best intentions for them. So I get that. But it's incredibly hard to ascertain the truth here. And I think the whole idea of like public opinion is a fallacy in and of itself, that there's one world of people. I think if your material conditions are met statewide, these things don't happen. And I think like last year they were starving for one because their new president, so Fidel Castro, 1959 to 09-ish, I think. Raul Castro, his brother, took over for the next decade up until 2021. And then right now, Miguel Diaz-Canel is the successor, and he's a bureaucrat. So, like, if you're a Cuban, you respect Fidel because he gave the middle finger to the biggest empire in the world.
Yep.
And he's your guy. Even if you don't like him, you fear him. And he may have imprisoned and starved your friends to death, but he is an intimidated figure who you see deserves power. Raul is his brother, so he carries that tradition on him, but they don't respect Miguel. I can see that. And they're kind of learning how to not be a dictatorship anymore. But Miguel wants to be a dictator. Like, he wants to be the guy. And he has like a bit of an inferiority complex, and he's trying to flex his muscle and show that he's in charge, but it's only polarizing any supporters of the regime against him. So it's complicated down there.
We've got to go to Cuba at some point. So people don't know this, but Mr. Michael here is an expert on this because he's an Afro-Cuban percussionist and musician. He knows this culture very well. I think it's just a matter of time. And I've said this for years. I mean, it may be 5 years, maybe 10 years, but it just seems inevitable because of the penetration, again, of American and Western culture into Cuba, and just seeing the things we have. Now they can see what Americans have and how we live, which is less and less appealing, but it's still way more appealing than living in Cuba for many people.
They're wearing bleached jeans, designer jeans, sunglasses, Chicago Bulls jerseys, like flat brim hats. They're all into hip hop culture.
And that is the revolution. That to me that's my foreign policy right there, is I just want to see those things and I want to encourage it and leave them alone. Just let them do that, because that is going to bring down any authoritarian regime. So you want to hear something funny about what's going on in the American left about about Cuba? There's been a really interesting twist.
Okay.
Black Lives Matter, since they're all Marxists, they did what the left is supposed to do, which is they came out basically squarely in support of the Cuban government. And they call the protests, imperialist bullshit or whatever, but they're pro-Castro, pro-communist in Cuba. Okay. That was a real problem for liberals, because liberals are still running the empire, and liberals, the Democratic Party, has never softened on Cuba. Not really, not in any serious way. The Democratic Party officially has been as anti-communist as anybody. And in fact, they invented anti-communism in the 1940s and 50s. That was the Democrats who were the big anti-communists, and they still are.
Was it Blinken recently who dodged the question about the terrorist, state sponsors of terrorist distinction for Cuba recently?
I don't know.
Somebody asked, I believe it was Blinken. I believe somebody asked Blinken about that recently, and he just totally dodged the question and said, well, there are criteria for being a state sponsor of terror, and we'll continue to look at that. But still to this day, they're considered a state sponsor of terror.
I mean, well, okay. I mean, so the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, the non-MAGA Republican Party, I should say, they want for Cuba what they want for every other country, which is to make it American. I mean, they want it, if not outright annex Cuba, they certainly want Cuba to be like, Germany is to us. They want Cuba to be a close ally and to be, our vassal state. So the Democratic Party now, though, is kind of infected with this wokeism a bit. They have like a woke wing led by AOC, et cetera, and all those people. So they got to like play that base too. They got to, So the line that's coming out of the Democratic Party, and you can see it being relayed through MSNBC, is that is that the Cuban government's really terrible, but not for the reasons the left says. The Cuban government is truly terrible, and we must have regime change there because they're racist.
Oh, I thought you were going to say homophobic.
They maybe say that too, but it's mostly about race. So if you look at MSNBC, its coverage of Cuba, that's what it's all about. It's all about the Castro and Diaz-Canel and the Cuban government are terrible, awful totalitarians and should be done away with. Just what all the big Cold War hawks have always said about Cuba. But the reason is not because they're communist. It's because they're racist.
There's some truth to that.
Oh, no, of course. Yes, of course. Absolutely. So there's a debate, just for instance, about how many Afro-Cubans there are. So according to the government, apparently it's about a third of the population is Black. But it's apparently, I don't know if you know about this, but apparently the real number is closer to 2/3. What do you think?
I would say it's great. I mean, look at the streets. It's pretty dark.
Yeah.
And the people in government are white as snow Spaniards. Always have been. And that's just is what it is. That's what the communist regime has always been. It's been white as snow Spaniards who came from wealthy student backgrounds, and the people have always been pretty dark. And part of that is due to the people who could afford to leave left. So those were whiter, and the descendants of slaves didn't have the resources to leave once communism took over. So that's probably why it's darker. But also, Cuba had second to Brazil, had the largest influx of slaves up until 1885. And so, decades after we outlawed the trade of slaves, they're bringing in massive, massive numbers recently. So, like people could say my great-grandfather was from Africa.
Right. So here's yet another example of what we call the empire. People in government in the United States who favor the constant expansion of American power globally. How about that?
Yes.
Those people have been using, and this is the latest example, identity politics to discipline the left, or the liberal left, I guess, to go along with the anti-Cuban program to help expand the empire, by shaming them, by saying, if you support this communist dictatorship, we don't care about it being a communist dictatorship. We care about it being racist. And they're shaming the left for supporting the Cuban government because it's allegedly racist, which it is and has been historically. At least I know in many instances has been super racist. In the 60s, Guevara and Castro, I think they specifically shut down Black cultural forms. They banned and censored Black cultural forms.
For a while they did, but then they state sponsored them because they were the only thing they had left
to co-opt, and then they co-opted them and tried to, and they defanged it, made it part of it, which is exactly what the Soviets did, and it didn't work. No one listened to the music because it sucked, because it was made by the government. Yeah, so
the Cuban stuff's awesome, though. The Cuban stuff's awesome.
Oh yeah. So identity politics, and this is what the smart lefties have been saying for a long, like Max Blumenthal, have been saying for a long time. Identity politics serves not conservative purposes. It serves reactionary imperialist purposes. It serves the purposes of the CIA and the leaders of the American empire, people who want America to conquer the world. It is paving the way for them. And so you see all these like very groovy Black women on MSNBC with afros now talking about how the Cuban government has to go, but because it's racist. It's wild. It's really wild. Because back in the day, not that long ago, before identity politics became a thing, the left was pretty much united in its support of the Cuban government, but certainly opposition to the embargo and opposition to U.S. policy in Cuba. The only split was about whether Cuba was real socialism, and therefore whether it should be supported for that reason or not. But no one cared much about the racial politics in Cuba, and that's what the left is trying. That's what the liberals are trotting out now. The Democratic Party, who want to annex Cuba. It's wild.
There's a Ron Paul line about foreign aid that it's taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries.
Boom.
There should be something similar. There should be a quote like that for embargoes and blockades, because all you're doing is you're punishing the poor in these countries. And it should be a matter of time, hopefully, until the embargo goes away. But it is shocking that it's been 60 plus years of an embargo on Cuba, and they pose no threat.
Also, you want to do as much trade with Cuba as you can. You want to flood that place with American products to show them what we've got and what capitalism can produce, and how fun it is to be an American, right? And how fun it is to not live in a communist society. You get to have all these things, right? We should be same with the Soviet Union. It was the same deal. They refused to trade with the Soviets, and consequently, it was hard for Soviet citizens to know what they were missing because they didn't see, outside this. They didn't know how Americans lived, right? But that's becoming less and less possible. I mean, Cubans know very well how we live, and I think increasingly they're either leaving, they're defecting, getting on rafts and paddling across the ocean to get here, or they are forming major opposition movements within Cuba itself, who may very well someday soon take over the country.
And the Cuban government is corrupt. it is. But I think we're still punishing them because they refuse to play ball in the banking system. Recently, they decoupled their dollar from our dollar, so the exchange dollar that they had, they got rid of. But you're talking about identity politics. They had a referendum a month ago on gay rights and same-sex marriage, and it passed. So something tells me that they're pushing that to kind of avoid some of these identity politics accusations that they're trying to get that ahead of the curve, because Che Guevara was notoriously homophobic and put gays in concentration camps.
I was just watching, I think it was Scott Ritter, actually. I saw him on some podcast because I follow him pretty closely, and he was on some lefty, I think, definitely communist podcast, anti-war podcast, and the guy had a huge poster of Che Guevara in his study where he was the host of the show. And I just, that guy, I mean, if you have the cultural sensibilities of most leftists, Che Guevara is your worst enemy. Like, the dude banned jazz. Like, every communist, an American communist I've ever known loves jazz, and all the black music. They love all the black music, of course. Well, that's exactly what they went after in Cuba. The communist regime there, led by Guevara, banned all that stuff, banned black music, black culture. Yeah, my God, Nick Gillespie, I think, has done the best work on that in Reason magazine, best I've seen anyway. He's written a pretty good takedown of Che Guevara and pop culture.
Yeah. When we do this show each week, it's like the same question. The news is telling me that Russia is losing, that Ukraine is finally gaining territory, and it's the end. But I want to attack this from a different angle. Elon bought Twitter. No, he didn't buy Twitter yet, but basically to avoid the lawsuit that he had coming his way for not buying Twitter, he's going to go ahead with the deal to buy Twitter, it looks like. It could be finalized within the next week, or he might back out again. But that and what he's been saying about Ukraine has been painting a target on his back, and we haven't highlighted on this show how crazy the rhetoric is. So he had this Twitter poll that I believe was a sincere just question about what we should do in Ukraine. So do we redo elections of peace of annexed regions under UN supervision? Russia leaves if that is the will of the people. So the elections in the Donbass that Russia held, that the United States is calling sham elections, redo it under UN supervision. keep Crimea as part of Russia. Crimea was very peacefully annexed. People talk about that as if Putin's Hitler, but there has been no conflict there really since he annexed it. Water supply to Crimea assured, Ukraine remains neutral. This is highly the likely outcome of the end, just a question of how many died before then. And then here we have Andrzej Melnik, who is the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, publicly just giving childish insults. Fuck off. Nobody's ever going to buy your fucking Tesla crap.
What? Who is that?
This is the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, these Ukrainians are not very diplomatic in their communications often.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Okay. I didn't realize that Elon had done this poll, but I knew other tweets he had sent out about Ukraine, which it matches that. Yeah, so I mean, he's essentially saying he's acknowledging kind of the major argument for people who are either sympathetic to the Russian cause or simply want to stop supporting Ukraine, which is that, and this is very clear, apart from this election that just happened, very clear, that the vast majority of people who live in the Donbass, certainly, Kherson and Zaporozhye, less so, but still, majorities most likely, but certainly in Donbass, the vast majority identify as Russian and they want to be part of Russia. And I mean, even before the election, again, before we knew this, I mean, you could just tell it was obvious, not just polls, but just countless interviews and just observing the politics of that region over the last 8 to 10 years. It's very pro-Russian. And so shouldn't we allow those people to determine what political entity they belong to? And that's what he's saying, I think, here. And it's interesting that he even got 42% saying yes. I mean, that's actually, I'm surprised he got that many people because of the way the Western media has been absolutely slanted against that since the beginning. And it's suppressed all sorts of information and spun every piece of information to make it look like not only is Russia evil, but that it's losing. And so there's no reason to give them anything, which is hilarious. I mean, an army that has been losing consistently does not end up controlling 20% of the country it invaded. And that's where we are now. It still controls 20% of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so clearly they were pretty successful, at least in part. And also that hasn't really changed since March. They've controlled that amount of territory basically since March. So it seems to me that's a good basis for a peace deal. Now after the referendums, even though, yes, I understand holding elections for such a thing under military occupation, you know, of course I hold those elections with a big grain of salt. But again, as I said before then, I mean, everyone knew how it was going to go because we've known for a long time that those people overwhelmingly identify with Russia. So we have a basis for a peace deal. Russia controls 20% of the country, but not all of the country, does not control Kiev, never successfully invaded Kiev, probably never wanted to. And so we can give the people of Eastern Ukraine what they want, and Ukraine can continue to exist as a sovereign country with the population that clearly in the West wants to be Ukrainian. So why can't we have this deal? This seems to me to be, you know, not perfect, but a pretty solid basis for a peace deal. Well, we can't have this deal, and they're attacking Elon Musk for suggesting it because the West has made it clear, and I mean the United States, Germany, the UK in particular, will not stop this fight, will not end this war until Putin is gone, until there's regime change in Russia. I mean, they have said this. Biden said it. Lloyd Austin said it. Boris Johnson has said it every single day since February. They're not going to stop the fight. They're not going to stop killing Ukrainians and Russians until Putin is done away with, one way or the other. This is fanaticism, which I keep, when I talk about,
It is fanaticism. You got to see this.
Yeah.
Aristoyevich posted this. This is the kind of thing that these are blue check accounts associated. This guy works for the Ukrainian military, but a very, very middle of the road peace deal that should be at least openly discussed. And there are kill lists out there by the Azov Battalion that people have been murdered for, and we're seeing on the platform of Twitter, Elon Musk in handcuffs. And we work promptly, so that has to be interpreted as a direct threat. And this is just openly accepted.
Yeah. Speaking of kill lists, the infamous kill list, the website, which lists all the critics of the Ukrainian government and of this war. And Daria Dugina was one of those people, and she was the first to be crossed off that list. The United States government just told the New York Times that, in fact, the Ukrainian government was behind it. Now, the thing about the Ukrainian government and its military or paramilitary operations, anything like that, pretty clearly has to get the okay from the CIA and the State Department of the United States. I mean, it's very clear. Now we also know that a substantial number of United States Special Operations soldiers have been on the ground in Ukraine since February. We know the CIA has been giving them intelligence. We know that they need the CIA to conduct the Ukrainians need the CIA to conduct this war. So if they really went off and just assassinated some philosopher's daughter for political reasons without getting the okay from the CIA, that would be very weird, very unusual, very major breach from protocol. So, I mean, United States maybe is trying to throw them under the bus before they get targeted, before they get fingered as the real culprits. It could be. That could be why the CIA admitted this to the Times. The CIA had no other reason to tell the Times any of this stuff. But anyway, so it's nasty. I mean, it's beyond nasty, the ruthlessness. And people keep talking about the ruthlessness of the Russians, which I'm sure has been the case, and it has been the case. I mean, they've been basically dropping bombs on towns and cities. I think they've been trying hard to avoid civilian casualties, but you can't entirely. So they, of course, have killed thousands of civilians. But the ruthlessness of the Ukrainian government and Western governments and media about this is really astonishing. And in the UK, I was at yesterday or 2 days ago, that was at the Daily Mail, which I think is the biggest newspaper in the UK now, had this big story about, what was the headline? It was like, Ukrainians are hunting down Russian collaborators and killing them like dogs. And the article was actually positive. It presented this in a positive light. That's what's going on, by the way, in areas that Ukraine has just recaptured from their little offensives. They are hunting people down and killing them in the street. And the West likes this. They applaud this. I want everyone, and I don't know why we're not just sort of asking this question every day publicly. Everyone has anyone seen any evidence at all to suggest that Vladimir Putin or anyone in the Russian government wants to take control of Germany, Britain, Poland, the United States, any other country that we live in the West? Is there any evidence? The answer is no. Zero. I mean, it would be against his interest to seek control of Western countries in any significant way. He's zero threat. He is no threat to us whatsoever. So again, why on earth is this our business? Except to satisfy Bill and Hillary Clinton's fanatical dream of having an American Eurasia. They want an American Eurasia. They want America all the way across that landmass. They'll eventually get to China, but they're going to go through Russia. They want to replace Putin because he's not playing that game. And boy, after that speech he gave last week, I guess, right after the annexation, oh my goodness, in which he calls out identity politics, he calls out transgenderism, he calls out all this stuff that the liberals have been trotting out across the globe, often forcing these poor countries to adopt measures supporting gay rights or trans rights to get their foreign aid. right? Bribing them essentially to do this stuff. I mean, he calls them out for that. So the Rubicon has been crossed. I think there is basically no chance of any sort of détente between Russia and the US now, which is very scary because they're all out to kill him, if not literally, then politically kill him. But they'd be happy killing him literally too. And then Putin knows it. And Putin is now saying, yes, I understand. You are annihilationists. You want to do away with our way of life, not just me, which is true. They want to reform Russian culture too. They want not just Russia to do business with American corporations. They also want Russia to have gay rights in their laws, etc.
Yeah. So the reason why I started out with JFK and Cuba is like, I thought we had learned our lesson from the Cold War, right? Like, isn't the standard position of an educated, enlightened liberal who has lived through the Cold War that was a horrible mistake to demonize half of the world like that? We almost destroyed the world in that process. And if you talk to the realists, the Kissingerites, the Pat Buchananites out there who lived through the Cold War, they're saying we've never talked about a dictator in my lifetime the way we're talking about Putin right now. We're talking about him worse than Saddam. We're talking about him worse than Assad, worse than the communists during the Cold War.
Worse than Joe Stalin.
Worse than Stalin, yeah.
For sure. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
At the time, when Stalin was still alive, we didn't talk about him like that. No. Yeah. It doesn't match anything that Putin has ever said or done. Nothing. I mean, it's just, there's a willful ignorance about who he is and what he wants and what he says. You couldn't watch the damn speech he just gave. A world historic speech, vitally important for geopolitics, for everybody, for the lives of everybody in the world. And they wouldn't broadcast it. I had to go find it from Sky News, which is sort of a second-rate media outlet
Australia.
In the UK.
Yeah.
Or one of those. Yeah. I mean, that was it. No American media would broadcast that speech in its entirety. You could not watch it. In that speech, everyone should go watch that. In fact, I was thinking about doing like a little mini class on it, but it is an incredible indictment of what he calls American colonialism. I mean, he throws all the way down, and he sounds often like a leftist in his criticism of imperialism and colonialism, the great powers, the American hegemon, but he also sounds very right wing in his denunciation of all this identity politics stuff. It's a fascinating speech, but it is the end. That speech, I think, marks the end of any possibility of a permanent détente with Russia, which is very scary.
It's sad because we could have had it in April. We really could have. We could have had it in March, you know.
Oh, yeah. They don't want it. The U.S. doesn't want it. They don't want it.
So I brought up the regime change. John Bolton just explicitly wrote this op-ed, Putin must go. Now is the time for regime change in Russia. He's tweeted that he was so proud of that headline, that he wrote that headline himself. And everybody should read through this article. But his argument is Putin thinks that we want regime change. He already, in his head, thinks we want regime change, so we might as well give it to him. It's his argument.
Where is John Bolton these days? Is a think tank paying him? Like, who does he work for now? I mean, directly work for?
Yeah, I don't know. This is published by 1945, which...
Is he at the CFR where he belongs? Is that where he is now? Some think tank like that?
I think so, yeah.
I just saw him on TV, was it today or yesterday, saying that Julian Assange should get 176 years in prison. Prosecutors are seeking 175 years, by the way, for Assange. U.S. prosecutors are. Bolton says he should get more than that because of the terrible crimes he's done to America. Nothing specific has ever been leveled. No one has ever said such and such agent in Pakistan was assassinated because of Assange's leaks, because of WikiLeaks. No. Yeah. But yeah, so anyway, back to this. I mean, this is what Biden said. This is what the president said a few months ago. We need regime. He's used the words regime change in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
This is fanaticism that could get every single person on the planet killed. And it's for no good reason. If you live anywhere other than Russia or Ukraine or maybe the Baltics, but I don't even think he wants the Baltics, this is irrelevant to you. He's not coming to hurt you. Putin's not going to do anything to any of us in the West. Nothing. In fact, he'd just prefer to trade with us. He'd prefer to continue selling us gas and oil. But no, we don't want to do that either. We'd rather destroy our own economies, the world economy, than do anything to help Vladimir Putin. It is what he's also not a communist. I mean, the communists had an ideology.
The communists had a global destructive ideology.
Boom.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, they officially stated, we want to spread communism around the world. And they had communist parties in every country, including this one, that were seeking to do that. They were trying to overthrow the governments in each of their countries, respectively, and were working directly for the Kremlin. He's not that. We don't have that. He's a capitalist, corporatist type. He wants to do business. He tried to do business in the 2000s, and they said, go to hell.
Yeah. More stuff is resurfacing on Twitter. This is a video which is great about Twitter. People show receipts now. Lindsey Graham and John McCain did a visit in 2016. Did you see this video?
No.
No, this is, all right, check this out. They visited Ukraine in 2016. Here's what they had to say.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
2017 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже, щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
Я вірю в те, що ви виграєте, переможете. Я переконаний в тому, що ви переможете, і ми вам допоможемо всіма можливими засобами.
Це те ж саме гільзи з ворожих БМП, які розмальовані художництвом Бердянська.
There we go again. Republican leaders taking direction from Democrats. This all is from the Clintons, and then later the Obamas, other Democrats, but it started basically with the Clintons. This is their project. It's the Democratic Party's project. These Republicans, as I've said, are and have always been junior partners in the Democrats' campaign to build the American empire.
But they're moderate Republicans. They agree with Democrats sometimes. That means that they're rational and that they can be worked with. They're not like those crazy MAGA guys.
Moderate. Yeah. I mean, sending thousands of surface-to-air missiles to a country no one's ever heard of, basically. I mean, moderate, okay? Seeking regime change, seeking a revolution, seeking to decapitate the government of a foreign country, again, that most Americans know nothing about and have never been to and never will go to. These people are radicals. Radicals. Ain't nothing moderate about them. Yeah, John McCain, people get obsessed with how horrible he was, and he was, but he wasn't the leader of this stuff. Again, he was taking directions from the Democrats and liberals. Liberals are the ones who built the empire, and they're the ones who are maintaining it. Yeah. Republicans just follow along because it seems like a good idea.
There's stooges. Ann Coulter has a Substack, and she has a show now on her own Substack, and she had a clip calling out the neocons, trying to get them out of the party by saying that they're just pseudo-intellectuals, that they're so obsessed with foreign policy because it makes them feel smart, that it makes them feel like they're informed. And kind of what you say, like junior Democrats, like they get invited to the table and they get taken seriously when really they have the most radical, dangerous ideas you could ever have.
Well, the neocons are Democrats and really always have been. They joined the Republicans just out of convenience in the 1980s and 90s when the Democratic Party, I should say, for a moment was quiet about expanding the empire post-Vietnam. but they came right back into it. I mean, this last election, Kagan and company, they all went right back into the Democratic Party. I don't know if they've joined formally, but they've been campaigning for Hillary Clinton, for God's sake, and other Democrats, and campaigning against Trump. So, yeah, no, the neocons, though, I will say this. The original neocons, Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, I've written a fair amount. Yeah, well, I've written a fair amount about Podhoretz, so I know a lot about his biography. Especially Podhoretz, very smart, very good intellectuals, actually. I think Podhoretz said a lot of stuff that's really interesting and really incisive. So did Kristol, for that matter. No, they were true intellectuals. It's just that they started off as lefties, either real socialists or like social democrats. And they stayed that way until the 1970s. A lot of them worked for Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington, who was famously beholden to Boeing, and who was famously a New Deal liberal Democrat who was an arch Cold Warrior. So they liked him a lot because he had their politics, which is basically a liberal domestic politics combined with an aggressive foreign policy against communism in particular. So Scoop Jackson kind of trained a lot of these guys, a lot of these neocons who ended up taking control of the Bush White House. But that's who they are. They're Democrats. They joined with Reagan only, again, out of convenience, because the Democrats were not saying the right things during the 1980s. But since Clinton came into office, they've been really happy with the Democrats, because Clinton and company, and then Obama, have been hawks. And these neocons are all, they like liberal domestic policies. No Child Left Behind, that horrific policy, seeking to centralize all the public schools in the country, that was Irving Kristol's idea. And it was enacted by Bush too, by W, but then Obama accelerated it, and now it's called Race to the Top. So Democrats love that policy of centralizing the curriculum for public schools. Came from the neocons, but again, it's all democratic liberal stuff. I mean, a real conservative would never do that, right? That is so hostile and antagonistic to conservatism, to centralize the school system nationally. That's the opposite of conservatism. So they're smart, they're intellectual, just like liberals are, and they're Democrats at heart.
Mm-hmm. I remember back in 2017 when Trump got elected, and everybody was saying, "Oh, he's going to throw Muslims in concentration camps." Just the crazy Trump derangement syndrome turned into "Stop making me defend Trump." The absolute ire of these people online and in our professional class has had me saying, "Stop making me defend Putin" for the last year, like,
oh yeah,
completely across the board. And with somebody like Elon Musk just asking the question, how do we resolve this conflict? That's all he's doing. Does anybody have any ideas so we don't enter a war with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world? That's all he's asking. For that crime, and for a lot of well-meaning liberals who are asking that same question, they are met with, "You are a traitor, you are Neville Chamberlain, you are all these things." They're met with direct threats. They're met with, "You're gonna, you're making apologies for somebody who's genocidal and wants to wipe out the whole world," when we're literally trying to avoid that if you're looking at this objectively.
Yeah, I mean, I've been called a Putin puppet for, I think it's now 10 years, ever since I was on RT with doing an anti-war thing. That was more than 10 years ago. That was like 2011, maybe. I was on this show Crosstalk a few times, which was a mainstay in the RT network. And because they would have like all the good lefty anti-war people on there, and libertarians too. And they invited me a couple times, and then I started to say stuff they didn't like, and I stopped being invited onto RT. But of course, I've been called a Russian stooge, a Putin puppet ever since then. My goddamn agent, my film and TV agent at the time, disowned me because of that, and called me he called me a stooge of Putin as well. It's really lazy, it's cheap, it's easy, you can get away with it. It's just a very convenient way to dismiss the opponents of American foreign policy, because people tend to believe it. They tend to believe that you're working for Putin. And I gotta say, listen, I follow, especially recently, a lot of media outlets that are that oppose U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war, I will say that some of them at times do sound like they might have some loyalty to the Russian government. I'm not going to name names, but some people who I really respect and who have tremendous analyses and who I think are generally right, at least on this conflict. I don't know what's really going on, but boy, they do sound at times like they're saying what Putin would want them to say. And I don't know what's happening there, but it's a problem. It's sad. And it doesn't help. It doesn't help us in opposing this war.
I am optimistic, at least. The Mark Sloboda episode is doing really well.
Yeah,
the Scott Ritter episode is the most popular
super well,
episode ever. And whenever we do good analysis with a good guest about Ukraine, it just organically spreads like wildfire. And I think people are craving good information on this stuff. So we get it.
The Duran, which is just so good. God, I listen to them every day. They are so good. They get like 100,000 views for every video they do. There's a huge international audience for them. And for all of us who do this kind of work, it's out there. I mean, it's big. I mean, there's actually a very large community, I guess, of people who are not left-wing, not libertarian. They're just opposed to U.S. foreign policy and they're opposed to the U.S. empire, which is, I didn't know this existed before. It's really exciting because having been in the anti-war movement my whole life, it's always been like 20 people. It's like 10 communists and 10 libertarians, and we do little marches whenever the U.S. does something bad. But apparently around the world, there's a lot of people who are very critical of U.S. foreign policy, who are also very smart, and that's who the Duran represents. They call themselves realists, part of the realist foreign policy school of thought, and which is different than a lot of anti-interventionists and anti-imperialists that I've known. It's quite an interesting thing that I've been learning about, and I really admire it quite a bit. Everybody, again, please go watch or listen to the Duran when you can. Alexander Mercouris is far and away the best analyst of international relations, geopolitics, all that stuff. They're the best.
Yeah. I did want to talk about John Mearsheimer as well. Yes, you want another realist? He's okay.
He's not as good as the Duran.
He's not.
Yeah. No, he's not. He's okay. But he's not. No, they're better.
Yeah. I did want to talk about Brazil, but like I would just be repeating everything the Duran said. Like,
I want to talk about Brazil though. It's really interesting and really important. So, Lula versus Bolsonaro. Left-wing populist versus a right-wing populist. Lula, I think, could be described as a social democrat. Even his left-wing supporters know that he's not a real socialist, not really a hard leftist. Bolsonaro, famously very close with Trump. The MAGA people like Bolsonaro. He's very famously anti-gay. He's been like explicitly anti-gay, but he doesn't call for killing gays. He doesn't call for outlawing homosexuality. He just says, we just don't like gays down here. And which is not entirely true, but anyway, he doesn't like gays. So I don't want to talk about domestic politics in Brazil because I'm far from an expert and I've never been there, but the foreign politics, the foreign policy of Brazil is really important. So what happened was Lula came into office in 2003 and immediately started making huge deals with China. Chinese Communist Party like swooped into Brazil, made massive investments, initiated huge amounts of trade, and China under Lula became the #1 trading partner with Brazil, replaced the United States. Replaced the United States as the leading trading partner with Brazil. That alone is of world historic significance. Bolsonaro comes in, he's buddies with Trump, he's part of the nationalist populist international movement. You're supposed to be anti-China if you're part of that. So he was talking the talk about how China's evil and blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what he did, though? More investment from China. He allowed more investment, more trade with China. So China is an even bigger trading partner with Brazil under Bolsonaro. And I wonder what MAGA folks are saying about that, by the way, because he's very much betrayed them. Because for MAGA, China, the CCP is the devil. they're worse than the Democrats to the MAGA. They hate China more than anything. Bolsonaro's been selling them out, and he's been selling much of Brazil to China. So also, we've had the emergence of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, as I've said this many times on the show, this new, amazing, emergent alliance that is counter to the United States and the West.
And that was originally Lula's project.
It was Lula's project. Lula, right. So because of China in particular, but Lula wanted to do trade with anybody because he had to pay. There was cash assistance, cash grants given to poor people in Brazil under Lula, which is why the left loves him so much. The government of Brazil gave out cash to poor people, like in huge numbers. The way he paid for that was with all this foreign trade, especially from China. China basically paid for Lula's social welfare programs that the left loves so much. So the question is, if Lula wins, it's very clear that relationship between China and Brazil will only continue to strengthen. China has also been investing heavily in almost every other Latin American country. China is the #1 trading partner, I believe, for 5 Latin American countries now. Massive investments, massive amount of trade with China in Latin America. So Lula will continue that undoubtedly if he wins, and he probably will win. The question, more interesting though, is what will Bolsonaro do if he wins? Because it looks now like he's very happy with his relationship with China. He's very happy with doing deals with China. He's very happy being a part of BRICS also. He's also been basically pro-Russia, pro-Putin in terms of the war in Ukraine, has supported Russia in that. So, we'll see. Either way, it looks like the anti-American, anti-West alliance will continue to strengthen regardless of who wins the Brazilian election. And that's the most important thing for us to understand.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. You didn't hear that on the Duran. That's an unreported original take right there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
The big take that I stole from the Duran is the polls were wrong. Lula was supposed to win overwhelmingly, right? This wasn't supposed to go to a runoff.
Right.
And just in the overall theme, Sweden, Italy, the populists have strong ground support. And we can't really trust the polls that we have that these people are considered crazy by most of their constituents. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. The rhetoric about Bolsonaro in the Western media and the American media is exactly the same as for Trump. They're anti-democratic. If Bolsonaro loses, they're going to stage a coup and take over the government with the military. Bolsonaro instituted some policies that gave the military a little bit more political power, apparently. But that's what it is. It's all about, well, they're not democratic. They don't believe in democracy. They're going to overthrow the government if they don't get their way, which might be true. And Brazil does have a history. In the 1960s, there was a military coup that took over the country. And of course, he's homophobic, and that's really terrible and probably racist. But it's none of that. That's not the reason the West opposes Bolsonaro. The West opposes Bolsonaro because he's made noise against NATO. Oh, the other thing is Lula also had a major deal with the EU. And the EU, if he comes into power, will have a major deal with Brazil. So he's going to be very tight. Brazil is going to be very tight with China and the EU. There you go. So that's why the Biden administration loves some Lula. Also, his party's social and cultural policies are like exactly the same as the Squad's. Very, very deep into identity politics. They sound just like AOC. So the Democratic Party loves Lula for all those reasons, but mostly because of his globalism. He's a globalist for sure, big time.
On the ground, in elections, personality, I believe trumps everything. Like in the United States, this is especially true, but I think everywhere people vote based on personality. And I think the reason why Bolsonaro got elected is because he got stabbed, and he overcame that. So he looked totally badass. And Lula was just getting investigated for corruption. So, you've got this anti-hero fighting against all the worst parts of corruption and danger in Brazil. That's what propelled him, I think, to get the upset 4 years ago.
I'd say he's even more like Trump in this. He clearly delights in talking shit about liberal pieties. You know, he has this, who's that British guy? He has that car show. He did an interview with Bolsonaro about gays, and Bolsonaro launches into this whole thing about gays, how we don't like gays, and he's smiling and laughing uproariously throughout the interview. He just thinks it's hilarious to make homophobic jokes, which I just don't care about one way or the other. Unless, I mean, it's all about policy and law. Although, you know, Glenn Greenwald has a lot to say about this. Because Bolsonaro, I guess, has attacked Glenn and his partner in some way or another. I'm not sure exactly how. I mean, not physically, but there was something. Yeah, he delights in making mischief. You can see that. I think even more than Trump does. And I find that entertaining. And I think that is why he's so popular. As you said, you're right. It's all about personality. And most people who vote in elections in the world care most about personalities. And it's hard not to be somewhat attracted to that. Someone who's willing to say what you're not supposed to say in politics.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
But Lula beat his corruption charges and he beat cancer. So as far as the narrative story arc is going, I think that's on his side. And he's still ahead. And the minor candidates in that election were leftists. So it's most likely that he'll
win
this one. Yeah.
I think he'll win. I mean, the Bolsonaro's people and then MAGA here are all saying the election is going to be stolen for Lula. You know, and who knows? I don't know. But it just looks like Lula's too popular, too powerful. His base of support's too big. Apparently, though, it's now very clear. Apparently, the polling in the election shows that Brazil's really split. The north and the west, which is where most of the poor people are, or their poorer regions, are solidly behind Lula. But the working class and middle class, and I guess the wealthy people in the west and south, which is where the cities are, they're for Bolsonaro. And so I think, just like Trump, I think it's actually like he has a big middle class and working class, what you call like solid working class support, which is also very interesting. The very poor support Lula because he gives them cash. I mean, I would support Lula too if I were very poor in Brazil. But people who have jobs or who own businesses tend to support Bolsonaro, just like here with Trump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's one more crazy thing coming out of Ukraine that I probably want to show.
Okay.
Did you see what Zelensky said recently on that call to that Australian group about a preemptive strike?
Maybe not. I don't know. What did he say?
Let me show you this.
Що повинно робити НАТО? Унеможливлювати застосування Росією ядерної зброї. Але, що важливо, я ще раз звертаюсь до міжнародної спільноти. Як це було до 24-го? Превентивні удари, щоб вони знали, що з ними буде, якщо вони застосують. А не навпаки, чекати ядерних ударів Росію, щоб потім сказати, ах ти так, ну ось тримай від нас. Переглянути застосування свого тиску. Ось я вважаю, що повинна робити НАТО. Переглянути порядок застосування.
So I take back what I said earlier about cocaine. No one should do it. It's a really bad drug. Mm-hmm. Because when you do cocaine, you start calling for preemptive strikes. When you do cocaine, which Zelensky apparently does a lot of, you make statements like this that would lead to World War III. That would be World War III. Preemptive strikes against Russia? I didn't know about this. I missed this somehow. Wow.
This is very recent. Yeah, this is, I think, today, actually.
Oh, yeah. Wowza, Voldemir. Jesus, man. Maybe he should smoke weed instead. He's unhinged, and I do think it's partly because of the cocaine or something that he's doing. He has moments where he's clearly unhinged, and this is one of them. But this is really, boy, he's also being encouraged, though, to say this by the West. I mean, the
hero every step of the way, and he's getting
Well, the rhetoric of the West has been just mind-bogglingly belligerent, fanatical. Calling for, I mean, there have been many mentions of using nukes in the Western media against Russia. over the last several months. I think he feels like he's entitled to say that. He's being encouraged or allowed by the West, who are his masters, to say something like that. That's, man. You know, when Alexander Dugin was on Unregistered in January, I mean, he's apocalyptic about the relations between the West and Russia. And at the time, I was really sympathetic to what he was saying, but I thought he might have been a little bit overstating it. But now we know. I mean, the war in Ukraine started exactly 1 month after I interviewed Alexander Dugin. And boy, I see what he means. Not only has his daughter been assassinated by these people, but they are talking about launching preemptive nuclear strikes on Russia itself, which is the death of all of us. I mean, that is apocalyptic. And these people are really scary and crazy. And I don't know. The media is just completely won over by NATO's point of view and will stop at nothing to advance this war until there's a mushroom cloud.
Yeah, we just gotta. It's this weird thing where the world is so polarized. In that, I think if you talk to anybody, who was it? I think Michael Tracy asked on Twitter, "Hey, shouldn't we, if we're going to go this far, shouldn't we hold it to a vote in Congress? Shouldn't we formally declare war on Russia?" How many U.S. citizens would like their representative voting for an explicit war against Russia?
Right. Well, now that Donbass and Luhansk are part of Russia, now that is Russia now, and we now know that we have U.S. soldiers, special operations soldiers, the ones who actually do shooting and stuff, on the ground there, and we know that U.S. military personnel are directing lots of activity by the Ukrainian military, and we know that we are supplying them with their weapons that they're using against Russia. I mean, this is a war now directly against Russia. And now Russia legally is obligated to respond in kind. We are at war with Russia now.
Yeah.
Technically, legally, and in every other way. Mm-hmm. And we now have Zelensky calling for preemptive nuclear strikes against Russia.
Yeah. Preemptive nuclear strikes might be a little bit much, but it's entirely able. You can read what he said and interpret that as that's on the table.
But he says preemptive strikes, and he's talking about nuclear. He's talking about nuclear weapons
in the context of Putin. He's saying that nuclear is on the table. Yeah.
I mean, maybe he's calling for preemptive conventional strikes, but that's still attacking Russia within Russia. Which is the worst idea in modern history, by the way.
Putin has never threatened to use nukes. That's something that's being repeated through the media a lot. All he's done is
one time. He said, if you use it, we'll use it.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all he said.
All he's done is here's our policy. Here's where our policy has always been. If you cross the lines of our policy, this is what it's going to be.
That's all he said. And he said it once. And he said it after months and months of government officials in the West and the media talking about using nukes against Russia. He said it once, and he said, if you use them against us, we will use them against you. That's all he said.
Yeah.
And it's grotesque.
But
we got to go.
Before we go over, I wanted to get this. The one thing that gives me optimism, because every week it gets worse and worse, and we get closer and closer. And one thing that gives me optimism is the episode in 2013 where it looked like where Obama looked like we were going to invade Syria. And just pretty much entire political opposition was just like, that's completely crazy. We don't need to do this again.
Yep.
Gaddafi was a nightmare. The Arab Spring was a nightmare. Iraq was a nightmare.
Yep.
And he backed off from it. And we've been fighting a proxy war in Syria ever since. But, he backed off from the full-scale war. And I think if we get people to start paying attention to this issue, we can actually get public opinion to where it's just not feasible for politicians to do this.
That's what we're doing, man. Right here.
Yeah.
That's why you should tell everyone about Unreported.
Yes.
Everyone should go out and tell everyone about this show because it will literally save the world.
The fate of the world depends on you sharing Unreported to 5 friends.
That's not untrue.
Yeah.
It's not untrue. All right. So we're going to go talk about everything at Unregistered Live right now. If you want to join us, all you got to do is go to patreon.com/unregistered, become a patron at any level, and you can hang out with us on Thursday nights after Unreported. Michael, you are the man.
Yep.
Thank you.
I got that RSS feed up. Tomorrow I'm downloading this.
Cool.
It's going to be out. So you audio-only people, you're going to have a feed now.
Of this show, of Unreported.
Of this show, yeah.
Beautiful. Awesome, man. Thank you.
Sweet.
All right, I'll see you on the other side.
See ya.